Welcome to Victor's Children, a podcast from so-called Canada talking socialism from below. My name is David Campfield. I live with my partner and cat in Winnipeg, Manitoba, which is in Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. All those of us in the Canadian state who aren't Indigenous need to commit ourselves to the struggle against settler colonialism. Victor's Children is a member of the Harbinger Media Network, which is a community working to support and promote left podcasts in Canada. Check out other shows like Tech Won't Save Us, Anti-Girl Boss Socialist Club, and Alberta Advantage. You can look at the shows list at harbingermedianetwork.com. Hello, this episode of Victor's Children is an interview with me by André Goulet on the podcast Harbinger Society Presents about Future on Fire and this podcast, Victor's Children. I'd also like to let listeners know that on April 15th, 2023 at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, the online magazine Midnight Sun and Haymarket Books are presenting an online discussion, Fighting Capitalism's Ecological Death Cult, featuring Sabrina Fernandes, who's a Brazilian eco-socialist and the founder of the Tese Onze YouTube channel, where she reaches thousands of people. She was a guest on episode 22 of Victor's Children in October 2022 on eco-socialism and the ecological crisis. And also Richard Seymour, the British socialist writer, author of Disenchanted Earth, The Twittering Machine, and other books, and me, David Campfield. The moderator will be Daniel Sarah Karasik, the managing editor of Midnight Sun. Register for this event by going to haymarketbooks.org and clicking under the events tab there. I also just mentioned that some people wonder why this podcast is called Victor's Children, and I'll just encourage you to check out episode number 1 back from February 2021, which is about Victor Serge, after whom this podcast is named. Also, if you have any suggestions for topics for episodes or guests, always feel free to drop me an email at victorschildren@gmail.com. Okay, so this month's episode is an interview with me by André Goulet.
Winnipeg activist and academic David Campfield is the author of Future on Fire, Capitalism and the Politics of Climate Change. We Can Do Better, Ideas for Changing Society, and Canadian Labour in Crisis, Reinventing the Workers' Movement, all from Fernwood Publishing. He also teaches labor studies and sociology at the University of Manitoba, and he's the host of Victor's Children, a podcast exploring socialism from below on the Harbinger Media Network. David, welcome to Harbinger Society Presents.
Thanks for having me on, Andre.
Tell us about Future on Fire. What is the book about?
Future on Fire is a short book that really starts with the key question of if we want climate justice, how could we get it? So it's not a book that talks a lot about the changes that are needed, because lots of people have written about that. It says a little bit about that. But the real question is, if we know what we need to do to address the urgent problem of climate change, how could we actually make the changes necessary? Mm-hmm. And so it looks at that, and then also looks at some of the questions that kind of come out of that are important, I think, and tries to do it in relatively few pages and in a way that's going to be as accessible as possible to people.
It's so short. It's basically like a novella. It's only 76 pages long. And so I'm wondering, what are the origins of the book?
Well, what's funny is, in fact, when you said novella, that when I was working on it, I thought, what's the nonfiction word for novella? There isn't actually in English something that quite fits, but that's exactly what I tried to do with it. So it came out of back in 2019, in the summer of 2019, when it became really clear that there was a lot of momentum for the climate strike that took place at the end of September of 2019, which seems a very long time ago, pre-pandemic, it became very clear that this was not just going to be another demonstration like previous demonstrations. There was a lot of momentum. There were a lot of people getting involved in organizing for that International Day of Action. And it was really inspiring to be participating in some of that work here in Winnipeg, where I live. But it was also really clear to me that a lot of people were coming into this with really no background in terms of thinking about strategy and not a lot of analysis about the causes of the problems. So I thought I might be able to contribute something to the movement by using my time to write something which would try to give people some tools for thinking about those kinds of questions. That's where it came out of originally. I'd been thinking about some of this stuff before, and I had the opportunity to teach a course at University of Manitoba, which was engaging with certain related issues. But then the movement arose, and there were tons of really young people involved, and I just thought this was something that I could contribute.
In this conversation, we'll be outlining each chapter of the book, and there's been so much going on in terms of movements since 2019, and we've gotten distracted a lot during the pandemic with the occupation of Ottawa, January 6th in the United States. But like in the autumn of 2019, 500,000 people took the streets of Montreal protesting for climate justice. This is a movement that's growing, and this book is so accessible and clearly written, not academic at all. It's got a lot of brevity, which is great. So let's begin by looking at chapter 1, The Path We're On. And it's probably obvious to the show's audience, but in a few words, at the beginning of the book, what path do you argue that we are on?
We are on a path towards, heating above pre-industrial average temperatures of something like 2.7 degrees by the year 2100. And that's part of a broader ecological crisis with all sorts of different dimensions. And there's a tremendous human cost and tremendous damage to other parts of nature. So that's a really disastrous path to be on. Right? Just to remind everybody, of course, is that governments have agreed to 1.5 degrees as the target we should be working towards, and certainly no more than 2. But the Climate Action Tracker actually says it's a go-to research organization for this thing, that we're something like, between 2.2 and 3.4 degrees, but 2.7 is in the middle of that. So way, way higher than where we need to be in terms of global heating and climate change. One other thing that chapter 1 says, which I think is worth underlining, is that the impact on people has everything to do with the social arrangements that we're living in. So there's a big difference between living in, a much hotter situation if you have a society that's actually been organized in a just way to adapt to that, versus one that has had no ability to do that. So one of the things it also just points out is that we can't, if we think about the consequences for people, it's not enough to simply know the climate science. We also have to understand how it affects society and how it plays out politically.
In chapter 2, will capitalists save us? What about governments? You talk about the potential barriers for if the left were actually elected, and what it would look like to confront the institutionalized liberalism in political parties, the capitalist forces within society. And you point to the interesting and well worth watching Norwegian Netflix drama Occupied, where progressives take power in a fictional Norway, and we see what happens when they meet the reality of these institutions. So capitalists won't save us, governments won't save us. Is that right?
Well, that's right. Or at least the chapter argues that certainly looking to so-called enlightened or green capitalists to deliver climate justice is ridiculous, and that the parties of the status quo, the main parties, aren't going to deliver this. Then we could imagine a situation where you might have, the NDP taken over by green left forces and then elected into office, and that would not be a bad thing. But the chapter does try to explain in a clear way what the obstacles to such a government implementing its climate justice agenda would actually be, and why it's a mistake to simply think that if you elect a party with the right policies into office, that's going to be the solution. I wish it was that easy.
In chapter 3, you talk about how mass movements are our only hope. And I liked how you explored the inspiring and pretty successful in terms of motivating hope events like the Dakota pipeline protests, the Extinction Rebellion tactics like souping Great Master paintings, and people can argue about whether it's stupid or not, but it definitely gets our attention. So I'd argue that these protesters, they're children. They must feel so bummed out about the world that's on fire right now. So give them a break. You also importantly talk about the Gilets jaunes movement in France in 2018 and 2019. And of course, Black Lives Matter. Gilets jaunes, though, is really interesting. It was about people were protesting about the rise in gasoline prices during Macron's first term in office. And what could have ended up being a really reactionary movement actually ended up combining progressive values with economic issues. So with mass movements, that's the hope, isn't it? But tell us more about that.
Absolutely. And so I was picking up on the line that Naomi Klein wrote years ago about how only mass social movements can save us now. And I've just tried to give people a sense of mass social movements in the past, because lots of us who haven't experienced that, won't know what it feels like. And it's hard to imagine then if we don't, know some of that history. But I do think that because of the barriers that face elected governments, if we, even the ones that would actually want to do the right thing in terms of climate justice, then, we need to shift beyond just electing certain kinds of parties into office and think about what forces in society could actually force governments to do what's needed. Mm-hmm. And so that's why there's a focus on social movements in that chapter. Just to pick up on the example you gave of the Gilets jaunes in France, I think it is a really important example precisely because it was really generated out of parts of French society that people didn't see as likely to throw up a movement. It wasn't at the beginning made up of the kinds of people who had been part of other anti-austerity fights in France for the most part, in terms of being more like outside of Paris, smaller centers, rural areas. And yeah, as you said, it could have easily been channeled to the right. But for a number of reasons, including the active participation of people on the left in that movement, it ended up starting around this issue of a tax on diesel, becoming a broader movement against social injustice. And with the slogan "Fin du monde, fin du mois, même combat," which is end of the world, in other words, climate change; end of the month, in other words, poverty, same struggle. That is a kind of a climate justice slogan. And so, for all its imperfections, that showed us, I think, the kind of movement that we might see more of in the future, coming out of unexpected places in responses to things that are affecting people in their everyday lives in terms of the cost of living, potentially being drawn away by the right, but also, unlike something like the convoy in Canada, which was clearly simply a reactionary move. What happened in France was capable of moving in a different direction.
And I think in chapter 4, you continue to explore that in Even a Ravaged Planet is Worth Fighting For. Unpack that a little bit. Why is a ravaged planet something that is still worth fighting for? Why shouldn't we give in to doomerism?
Well, that chapter is trying to look at a question that a lot of people shy away from, I think, which is what happens if emissions rise, greenhouse gas emissions, that is, rise in a way that lock us into temperature increases of, more than 2 degrees, which is horrifying. But we need to think about this for a couple of reasons, both because, if people, we obviously need to fight to limit emissions as much as possible in a just way. There's no doubt about that. But if people think that literally the world will end, or it's not worth living if we don't achieve the necessary reductions, then I think that's a real problem. Both because of how people will suffer in terms of mental distress if we end up in that kind of a scenario where climate scientists tell us this, and because also people will need to be able to continue the fight, even if we find ourselves in that situation. And I think we need to avoid the danger that as more emissions continue to be pumped out, and as the trajectory of heating gets worse, there will be a greater appeal of politics which say we need to slash emissions, we need to also adapt, but without any consideration of social justice. So there's the danger of right-wing climate politics having an appeal to people who are just feeling desperate about the future. And that could be disastrous, really reactionary, authoritarian, right-wing politics of emissions reduction, or, there are other possibilities around things like solar geoengineering, which, would be very, very worrying. And so trying to help us think about some of these things instead of thinking it's, all or nothing. Mm-hmm. We either limit emissions or it's the end of the world. Well, that's not helpful, because we may end up in a situation where we're heading towards, really even more frightening temperature increases, and we have to think about how we continue to struggle in those circumstances.
My reaction to that chapter was just to kind of check my own doomerism and to remind myself that to fight and to care in the face of what sometimes seems like a slow motion apocalypse continues to be really important. And Chapter 5 explores eco-socialism, which is a buzzy term, but Dimitri Lascaris ran on that when he came just 2,000 votes shy of beating Annamie Paul for the leadership of the Green Party of Canada, and we see it in a lot of other political movements around the world. So tell us, how did you explore eco-socialism in Future on Fire?
Well, it's the shortest part of the book, and it basically argues that ultimately, we need to fight for emergency climate justice reforms within capitalist society, because that's where we find ourselves, but that ultimately, to address the ecological crisis, we need to break with capitalism and begin a transition to eco-socialism. It just tries to argue for, because people use the term eco-socialism to mean quite different things. So by eco-socialism, I don't mean just capitalism with a whole lot of climate justice reforms, with regulated capitalism. And I also don't mean a situation where you have just undemocratic state ownership of the economy along the lines of what used to exist in the former Soviet Union and similar countries, but with a green, dimension. I'm talking here by eco-socialism about, ultimately a society based on producing for meeting people's needs and for having a sustainable relationship between humanity and the rest of nature, in a way that's fundamentally democratic and is moving towards, a genuinely eco-social society would be one that had gone beyond social class divisions, beyond having an alienated state, and that would be the ultimate vision. So kind of a small C communism that was genuinely centered on addressing the ecological crisis. So that's ultimately, I think, what needs to be our political horizon and guide us as we try to build the mass movements around what's affecting people in the here and now, and putting forward climate justice solutions to those problems.
So coming out of the book, I was able to recognize sort of what to look for to help me feel better in these grim times, right? And so, like, for instance, at COP15 happening in Montreal right now, these protesters came in and chanted obtrusively when Justin Trudeau was sort of giving the welcoming speech, and that made me happy, right? So I guess I'm wondering, for you, what makes you happy? What makes you optimistic in these times? What does that look like for you?
Well, I think the places that I find hope are wherever we do see collective, action and resistance, especially at higher levels. So whether that's right now the protests happening in China itself, or this in Ontario recently, very recently, the education workers in CUPE who successfully, took on the Conservative government, the Ford government there, and forced the repeal of really aggressive anti-union legislation. And I mean, I think that struggle had the potential to go further than it did. But those are just some things recently that give me hope. But some people accuse me of not being very optimistic or being pessimistic. But I think that the real, to simply affirm that we're not doomed, right? To simply refuse the doomer response to all the problems in the world today, and to say the door is not closed. We can argue about how much light is shining through the crack, but that it's not game over, and that the only hope will be to throw ourselves into the attempts to make history, however they unfold in our lifetimes. And that engagement with other people trying to do that is a way of trying to stay sane in these terrifying times.
I'd like to hear a little more about your academic background. You teach at the University of Manitoba. Tell us more about your work there.
Yeah, I've been at University of Manitoba since 2003, and I teach labor studies and sociology. I studied before that at York University, did all my degrees there before I eventually uprooted and made a new home and a new life in Winnipeg. Okay. And so for me, it's a job that I certainly enjoy doing, but I've always felt that it's not a substitute for political work, which you do outside, of the things that we get paid for to do this kind of thing. And so I've always tried to maintain activity in whether it's my union or some activist work happening in the community as well.
And it seems like you're also carrying on that educational aspect of the work you do in this new medium now with the podcast Victor's Children. So tell us more about this show and who's Victor?
Right. So it was something I conceived back in 2020. So in an early phase of the pandemic, when I was listening to more podcasts and this kind of thing, and feeling that there really wasn't a program that was coming from or addressing issues from a perspective or that would be perspectives that would be similar to at least what I would call kind of an anti-racist, queer feminist socialism from below. And so I thought, well, maybe this is something I can offer, is to try to do this. And so it started at the beginning of 2021. It's almost 2 years old. And it's named after Victor Serge. Victor Serge was a writer and socialist activist in the early 20th century, born 1890, died 1947, originally from Belgium. But he went through an incredible series of experiences as a participant in French anarchism and syndicalism, then in Russia during the early years of the Russian Revolution, then an opponent of Stalinism, amazingly able to get out of the USSR before the great purges of the 1930s. But he was always also, because of his independent perspective, kind of on the outs with the Trotskyist movement, which was the main anti-Stalinist Marxist opposition. So that he was part of it, but critical. And then eventually fled Europe and ended up in Mexico, where he died. And so he had an extraordinary life. I mean, it's an amazing thing that someone who lived through this experience has actually lived, because he was this sort of only kind of survivor of these experiences. So many of them, and he chronicled these experiences in both in fiction and in nonfiction, a whole number of remarkable novels and an amazing memoir called Memoirs of a Revolutionary. And so Victor Serge was really deeply committed to, opposition to capitalism, opposition to Stalinism, but also above all to an independent thinking, ruthlessly honest and critical socialism. And so he was someone who has always been inspiring to me, and I thought, well, this could be a show for his great grandchildren, to bring people together who would identify with him, and perhaps also to make him a little bit better known. So the very first episode of the show talked a little bit about who Victor Serge was, but it is of course a bit cryptic, because most people don't know who he was today.
Yeah, and it explores so many interesting themes, like the most recent episode on eco-socialism, talking about labor in Canada. You had a great episode, Dialectics Demystified. You talk about sexual violence, feminism, and socialist organizing, moralism on the left, the history of Canada's reproductive justice struggle, just to name a few. So I'm sure it's hard to choose, but what are some of the highlights of the show? What are some interviews that you've done that have been especially meaningful so far? Yeah,
I mean, I'll just mention two. The Dialectics Demystified episode with David McNally, which is the most popular episode so far. I really like that episode because of the way that David has a remarkable ability to discuss complex philosophical questions in a very clear way without simplifying them in a dumbed down kind of way. And so I didn't expect that to be the most popular episode, but it was interesting. So I think it just speaks to people discovering Marxism and wanting to understand these ideas that they haven't had access to before. And so that was interesting. And then also there's an episode called It's the Enemy of My Enemy, My Friend, with Barnaby Rain, which looks at the so-called tanky and campist political phenomena. And that was the second most listened to episode so far. And it struck people at the Breach, who picked up on it and published an edited transcript, or an edited part of the transcript of that piece. And I think that's important because Barnaby puts forward in that episode a critical take on a certain kind of politics that have become more influential, and I think it hadn't been enough engagements with them like that. So that's also a special episode in my mind.
Why did you choose to explore podcasting as a medium? And why did you choose to join Harbinger?
Podcasting is interesting. One reason is like I have really bad musculoskeletal problems that limit my ability to type, to work at the computer. And so I wish that my body would allow me to write, but I actually can't. And so this is a way of engaging with ideas other than writing. And also, I think there are people who like to engage with ideas in this, form of audio that's different than reading. So there's both personal interest and I think then a listener hunger for this. So that's what led me to podcasting. And Harbinger, because it's really a unique project in trying to bring together some really great podcasts based within this part of the world we call the Canadian state. And, it's an eclectic mixture, but some really interesting shows, including ones that I like to listen to. And I think anything we can do to try to overcome the fragmentation of the left, especially the radical left, in the world of podcasting or any other medium is really good to bring together and try to make more than the sum of the parts, a whole bunch of projects that people are working on separately. I think if it leads people to discover shows they would never have heard about before and allows the shows that exist to, in some ways feed off each other, then I think that's great. So I take my hat off to Harbinger.
Yeah, I agree. I love that aspect of it too. And so as we begin to wrap up, what can we expect to hear from Victor's Children in 2023?
Yes, I haven't had as much time to think about this, but I'm planning an episode on this recent struggle of education workers in Ontario, which was really important. And that's going to be one episode. Next year is going to be the 30th anniversary of a book that David McNally wrote called Against the Market. And I'm thinking about doing an episode connected to that, about we're told the market is the only way to organize economic life, but and that there's a version on the left of that called Market Socialism. So 30 years ago, this really excellent book came out that took on those ideas and argued for democratic planning as an alternative. So I'd like to revisit that on its 30th anniversary and have David back on the show for that. He doesn't know that yet, but that's the plan. And then also next year is going to be the 100th anniversary of the near revolution in Germany. That Germany was racked with social upheaval between 1918 and 1923. Most people don't know about that in this part of the world. And so I'd like to have someone on to talk about the events of that year in Germany, because the fact that there wasn't a revolution had a big impact on the course of the 20th century. So those are just a few ideas at this point.
David Camfield is the author of Future on Fire, Capitalism and the Politics of Climate Change. You can find more of his writing online at his website at prairiered.ca and subscribe to Victor's Children, available wherever you get your podcasts and at harbingermedianetwork.com. David, thanks a lot for speaking with me today.
Thanks, Andre. That's it for this episode of Victor's Children. I'd like to thank Jonathan Croker, the producer of Victor's Children, without whom the podcast wouldn't be possible. I'd also like to thank Posey Legg, who designed the graphic for Victor's Children. If you found the episode worth listening to, please do tell other people about the show, since word-of-mouth recommendations are especially helpful. If you don't subscribe through your preferred podcast app, please do. And while you're there, please give the show a high rating. It helps to promote us. If you have a suggestion for an episode or some other kind of constructive feedback, feel free to be in touch with me. You can contact me through victorschildren@gmail.com.